I never thought the very apartment on the Upper West Side, where I had lived for nearly 40 years, would one day become the stage for the most brutal shock of my life. That morning, the sirens of a fire truck tore through the peaceful street. Windows flew open, neighbors rushed out, everyone pointing toward my home, the home I once proudly called a sanctuary. I stood at a distance, still holding my cup of coffee, trying to appear calm. But my heart pounded violently when I saw Claudia Russo, my son, in his firefighter's uniform, leaping from the truck, his face grim. Luca, the child I had sacrificed everything to raise, was about to confront the most devastating truth. His father and his wife were trapped inside, stripped bare in a humiliation they could no longer hide. The alarm blared, thick smoke poured from the kitchen window. Neighbors whispered, "Someone's inside." "Isn't that Mrs. Russo's apartment?" "I heard her husband." The voices faltered, and I drew a long breath. I knew this moment would change everything, but if you think it all began with that rising smoke, you're wrong. In truth, it started long before, on a silent night when I found something seemingly harmless inside my husband's car. Our apartment on the Upper West Side was usually quiet at night. Only the steady tick of the wall clock could be heard, the old clock my late mother had given us as a wedding gift. Each beat felt like a small cut, reminding me that 40 years of marriage was no longer what I thought it was. That night, Anthony Russo, my husband, returned from what he called an important meeting on Wall Street. He walked in looking weary, loosening his tie as if he had just fought the entire world outside. But I knew better. From the moment he stepped through the door, I caught a strange scent clinging to his suit. Sweet, strong, undeniably feminine. Not mine, and certainly not from any office. He tossed his jacket onto the sofa, muttered something about difficult partners, and headed straight to bed without even showering. Soon, his snores filled the apartment. I remained at the kitchen table, gripping a cup of chamomile tea gone cold. The night was still as glass, but inside me unease was spreading like a shadow. I began to tidy up. After so many years, my movements were practiced, almost noiseless. I picked up Anthony's wallet, his phone, his old laptop, and then I noticed the phone screen was still lit. A new email glowed against the dark like a careless confession. "You were incredible tonight, Dad." I froze. For 40 years, Anthony had complained that email was too complicated, that he preferred to just make calls. Yet here, at midnight, was a tender message that pierced straight through me. Dad. Who would address him like that, in such an intimate, shameless way? I scrolled for more, desperate, but found nothing, only a cryptic email address made of random letters. No name, no photo, no clue. Just that single red heart, mocking my naive trust. Startled by the sound of Anthony shifting in bed, I set the phone down quickly. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. I forced myself to keep moving, to pretend nothing had happened, though my heart was pounding like a thief's. As I gathered his clothes, my hand brushed against a folded slip of paper in his trouser pocket. A receipt from Keen's Steakhouse, Midtown Manhattan. 2 dinners, 1 bottle of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon, dated that very night. Anthony had told me he was at a meeting in Wall Street. Yet the receipt spoke clearly. He had enjoyed a lavish dinner in Midtown. With whom? Who had sat across from him, sipping the same wine he once bought me for our 10th anniversary? A memory cut through me. That evening 10 years ago, when I had just opened the Hudson Hearth Bakery on Amsterdam Avenue, Anthony had surprised me with that very wine, raising his glass proudly under flickering candlelight. I had believed in his smile then. Now, that memory felt like a faded photograph in an album of lies. I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the distant glow of Times Square flicker across the city skyline. I wanted so badly to believe I was wrong, that I was imagining things. But the intuition of a wife of 40 years is never mistaken. Something had rotted in this marriage. That night, I made a decision. I needed the truth. No matter how painful, I couldn't allow myself to live in shadows any longer. The next morning, when Anthony left the house in his familiar gray suit and polished leather briefcase, I stood still, watching the door close. He turned back with a smile, the smile of a husband who had been performing for 40 years, but in his eyes I saw a flicker of falsehood. I waited a few minutes, then picked up the spare keys and headed down to the parking lot. Anthony's black SUV was still warm, the faint smell of gasoline mingling with a sweet, lingering scent from the night before. I opened the door, my heart pounding as if I were the one committing a crime. The glove compartment snapped open, spilling loose papers, and there, among the mess, was a small silver tube. I picked it up, morning light glinting off the cloudy cap where sticky residue had dried, a nearly empty tube of lubricant. I froze, my hands trembling. It had been years since we were intimate. Anthony always claimed he was too tired, that age had drained his desire. Then who was this for? I placed it back exactly as I'd found it, scrubbing my hands raw with a napkin as if I could erase the betrayal. But when I leaned toward the back seat, I found more scraps. Crumpled napkins soaked in a cloying fragrance. Not the gentle rose water I used, but something brazen. Jasmine and vanilla, loud and vulgar, like a mocking laugh in the silence of night. I pulled out my phone and photographed everything. The tube, the napkins, every trace. I knew I would need proof. Once Anthony realized I was suspicious, he would erase it all. Back in the apartment, I couldn't sit still. I opened a drawer of old keepsakes and found photo albums. One picture showed Anthony as a young man holding Luca in his arms. I set it on the table and stared before letting out a bitter laugh. The man in this picture died long ago. That night, when Anthony returned, I played the role of the dutiful wife. I set the table, poured the wine, made small talk about the news in the city. He laughed, spinning stories about difficult clients on Wall Street. His eyes never touched mine, and in that moment I realized I was nothing more than a shadow beside a stranger. I needed an ally, someone outside, objective, who could confirm the truth. A name surfaced in my mind. Gloria Jenkins, the friend who had helped me in the early days of my bakery. I remembered her words over coffee years ago. "Claudia, if you ever suspect Anthony, I know a private investigator. He's discreet. Don't hesitate." I picked up the phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing. When Gloria's voice came through, my throat tightened. I managed only one sentence. "Gloria, I need his number. I need to know the truth." She was silent for a beat, then replied, her tone heavy, "Are you sure, Claudia?" "Once you see the truth, there's no going back." I closed my eyes, breathing deeply. There's no other way. An hour later, a text arrived. The contact for Declan Wright, a private investigator in the Bronx. The following evening, I met him at Blue Bottle Coffee near Bryant Park. The cafe was small, golden light spilling over worn wooden tables. The scent of roasted beans filled the air, but did nothing to calm the unease twisting inside me. I sat in a shadowed corner, clutching a USB drive with the photos I'd taken. Declan arrived, a man in his 50s, solidly built, wearing a light blue shirt. His eyes seemed to read past the surface, to strip away the mask I was trying so hard to wear. I slid the USB across the table. "This is everything I have. I think my husband is cheating." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. Declan examined the files, his expression unreadable. He took careful notes in a small notebook, then looked up. "Mrs. Russo, I'll begin surveillance today." "Don't worry, you'll have answers soon." I nodded, eyes burning. There was no turning back. The wheel had begun to spin, and I knew it would crush the false world Anthony had so carefully built. That evening I sat in Hudson Hearth Bakery, the oven ticking and the familiar scent of yeast and flour lingering in the air. But instead of comfort, I sat motionless at my desk, my hands trembling over the delivery invoices. My phone vibrated. My heart felt like it would leap out of my chest. A message from Declan Wright. "I've got photos." "Brace yourself, Mrs. Russo." I drew a long breath and opened the message. The screen lit up with a photo. Anthony in his usual light blue shirt, walking hand in hand into an upscale midtown restaurant. The woman beside him. I froze. It was Jasmine Carter, my daughter-in-law. My throat tightened. Jasmine in a tight black dress, dark red lips, her hair down and glossy. They did not walk like a father and daughter-in-law. They walked like a couple, shoulder to shoulder, exchanging looks in a language I had never been allowed to see. My hands shook and my phone nearly slipped to the floor. I forced myself to open the next images. At a candlelit table strewn with flowers, Jasmine leaned in to laugh, her eyes sparkling. Anthony raised his glass, looking at her with a tenderness that crushed me. In 40 years of marriage, he had never looked at me like that. When Declan sent a short video, I pressed the headphones to my ear. In the frame, Jasmine whispered something into Anthony's ear, and he laughed freely. An unfamiliar laugh. They left the restaurant, and Anthony opened the car door for Jasmine like a gentleman. I replayed the clip again and again, each frame a dull knife driven deeper into my chest. Jasmine, the daughter-in-law I once held in my arms like my own child, the one I taught to make flan and wrap Christmas gifts. And Anthony, the husband I had trusted my whole life. Both of them had betrayed me, betrayed Luca, betrayed everything we called family. I sat stunned, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. Memories crashed in. Birthday parties, smiling family photos. All of it had been a performance. Jasmine and Anthony had acted their parts so convincingly. In front of us, they pretended distance and coldness. In the dark, they were allies, lovers, and worse. My phone buzzed again. Declan wrote, "They left the restaurant and checked into a 4-star hotel. I'll keep watching. Prepare yourself." I opened the new photo. Jasmine resting her head on Anthony's shoulder on a 3rd-floor balcony. Then, a quick, small kiss, brief but enough to burn the last ember of hope inside me. Pain exploded in my head like lightning. I sat amid the bakery, but everything blurred. The smell of flour, the chatter of customers, the world felt distant. I had lost everything: my husband's love, my faith, my family. Only one thing remained clear in my mind. I needed complete proof. Every photo, every recording, and then they would pay. That night, I returned home in a haze, my mind full of the images Declan had sent, the smiles, the touches, the looks of tenderness from the man I once called my husband. I wandered the apartment like a ghost, running my fingers across familiar surfaces as if searching for some trace of the life I thought we still had. Then Declan messaged again. "I have something more, an audio recording. Prepare yourself." I sank into the kitchen chair, headphones pressed tightly to my ears. At first there was only the faint sound of footsteps, the rustle of paper. And then came Jasmine's voice, no longer the warm, playful tone of a daughter-in-law I once embraced like my own child. It was cold, sharp, ambitious. "Dad, hurry and sign here. I've already arranged everything with the notary's office. Once the transfer goes through, the bakery chain will be ours. That old woman will be out, and all of it will belong to us." Anthony's laugh followed, familiar yet sickening in this context. "Don't worry. She trusts me. I'll make sure it all goes smoothly. She won't suspect a thing." Each word was like a stone hurled into my chest. This wasn't just infidelity, it was a conspiracy. They weren't content with their affair. They wanted everything I had built with my bare hands. 40 years of sweat and sleepless nights, hauling sacks of flour, fighting for contracts, defending the bakery's name. Now they plotted to steal it all. I replayed the file, transcribing every word as if engraving it into stone. Jasmine's voice brimmed with calculation, Anthony's with greed. They spoke casually about bending legal clauses, about timing the transfer, about allies who could smooth the way. Every detail mapped out, as if my downfall was nothing more than a business plan. The betrayal no longer cut only as a wife. It enraged me as a woman who had built something from nothing. They wanted not only to break my heart, but to erase my life's work. Yet amid the storm inside me, a quieter voice emerged. "Claudia, don't act rashly. Let the evidence speak. Let the truth destroy them, not your rage." My late mother's words seemed to echo. Mercy is never wrong, but justice must stand on proof. I called Declan the next morning. My voice was steadier than I felt. "I need everything. More recordings, contracts, evidence of their plan. If they're conspiring to steal my bakery, I want it airtight." Declan's voice was firm. "I'll get it. But be careful. Don't let them sense you know. They're cunning." And so I began to prepare. I saved every receipt, copied contracts, organized files with meticulous care. I printed every photo Declan had sent and highlighted the key details. Each page went into a thick envelope, a silent weapon I would one day use. But the thought of Luca, the son who trusted both his father and his wife, stabbed me deeper than anything. How would he bear this truth? To know the two people closest to him were betraying him together? I whispered to myself in the stillness of the bakery that night. This isn't only for me. It's for Luca, so he won't live under the weight of their lies. I will strip away their masks and make sure they can never deny the truth. When that determination settled in me like steel, I knew there was no turning back. The plan to expose them was no longer just an idea. It was in motion, and it would be done my way, with evidence, with clarity, and with the whole community as witness. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the windows of Hudson Hearth Bakery, I stood among warm trays of pastries, my hands dabbing a damp cloth while my heart felt ice cold. I had proof. Declan was hunting down every scrap to complete the picture, but proof alone wouldn't be enough. They knew how to shift narratives, to erase traces, and if the truth remained only in a few photos, they could litigate, deny, and stall. I needed a public unveiling so obvious that the community would witness it and the law could not look away. I sat down and spread everything I had across the table. Declan's photos, printed emails, the receipt from Keen's, the audio file, and a thick envelope filled with contract copies. I marked every detail: date, time, restaurant name, hotel room number, the exact words from the recording. Each scrap of paper became a brick in a case that could not be denied. Declan and I talked through each step. "You must leave them no room to wiggle," he said. "Expose it publicly, then follow up with legal pressure." I agreed, but I also knew I had to avoid anything that could harm someone or put me on the wrong side of the law. My goal was exposure, not injury. So my plan unfolded along 3 parallel tracks. 1. Amplify the evidence. Declan would keep surveilling to gather more photos and audio, but I needed one physical sign to appear in a place they would not expect and that neighbors could record. I chose a safe tool, a harmless UV reactive gel I bought at an art supply shop, non-toxic and non-injurious, and planned to swap Anthony's tube for a visually identical one containing the UV gel. When used in dim light and exposed to a UV lamp, faint traces would show up, visible proof that could not be easily scrubbed away. Note, everything I did was designed to reveal, not to burn or wound. 2. Trigger a safe public exposure. I needed neighbors to come and witness, to film with their phones, people outside our circle, to increase objectivity. Instead of starting a fire, I used a safe alternative, a small stage fog machine, a professional unit that produces vapor, not flames, discreetly placed in the kitchen and connected to a remote trigger. When the fog filled the space, alarms and commotion would prompt neighbors to call FDNY. I consulted Declan extensively to ensure the machine was the safe, theatrical type, no open flame or heat source. The point was only to create a reason for responders and neighbors to enter. When the firefighters came in, the UV traces, the other physical signs, and Declan's recordings would already be ready to reveal. As Declan warned, don't do anything that could cause injury or property damage. Let the law and the press do the work. 3. Legal prep and social closure. I contacted a lawyer a friend recommended to prepare divorce papers, documents proving my ownership of the bakery chain, and injunctions to prevent any transfer of shares. Declan would work to gather transactional records, emails, and any proof of transfer attempts. I also asked a trusted neighbor, Evelyn Gold, to be nearby on the day I planned the reveal, so there would be an independent witness and phone footage. I wanted the evidence to appear not only on private devices but to spread quickly, posted in neighborhood groups, shared with local reporters, and if necessary, presented to authorities. As I planned, I was mindful of Luca. I didn't want him to be the first to discover it. I didn't want him to be blindsided by strangers' footage. I considered calling him at the right moment, but Declan advised, "Let him see the case when it's complete, so he isn't the one forced to interpret it on the way to the scene." I agreed. Luca must be protected from further shock. In the days of preparation, I kept reminding myself, everything had to be legally and ethically clean. I made extra copies of contracts, packed the evidence envelope in my bag, drafted a statement for the lawyer, and prepared a written account for the local paper. I reassured myself, the aim is exposure, to let the community and the law judge. No harm, no illegality. The night before the trigger, sleep would not come. I thought of the cooling flan in the display case, of the customers who had supported the bakery for decades. I thought about Luca and how we would have to pick up the pieces together. I whispered, "Let the truth shine, and let it be what changes our lives, not hatred." The plan was ready. Now it was only a matter of timing. When Jasmine would come to the house, when they felt safe, when Declan would be in position to capture everything. I knew this action would change my life forever. But for the first time in years, something like a cold peace settled in my chest. At last, the truth would be told in evidence that could not be denied. The day I'd set arrived. My heart drummed like a small machine, but my face was cold and composed, the kind of composure that comes from someone who has decided to see things through. Early that morning, I tucked the thick envelope of evidence behind the counter, locked the bakery, and left a little note saying I'd be on a business trip to Boston. A few loyal customers glanced at me with concern and gratitude. I nodded back, playing a part I had learned to perform. Late afternoon, I went over to Evelyn Gold's house. Evelyn is the sweet neighbor who always sips tea by the window. I handed her a cup and asked her to sit on the porch and keep an eye out for me, just in case. It was a small favor she kindly accepted. I lied lightly. "I'll be home soon." She nodded, none the wiser. Declan was in position about a 15-minute drive away, and I sat nearby with my headphones on, listening for his quiet updates. I had a small remote control tied to the safe stage fog machine I'd hidden in the kitchen. The plan was simple. When they were inside, I'd trigger the fog. The thin vapor would drift from the kitchen window. A neighbor would see it and call FDNY. When the fire crew came in, Declan would already have recordings, photos, and the UV traces ready to be exposed. I sat at Evelyn's window, eyes fixed on the street. The clock neared 9. A taxi pulled up in front of our building. Jasmine stepped out in a floral dress and dark sunglasses. Anthony came out to meet her with the practiced, solicitous smile of a man used to playing his role. They walked in and closed the door, and Declan's voice whispered in my ear, "They're inside. Are you ready?" My hand trembled as I pressed the button. Inside the bedroom, the usual sounds of two people together, soft voices, the clink of glass, were suddenly joined by a small, tense exhale. I felt a mixture of tension and relief. This would reveal everything, but I wasn't fully prepared for how it felt to hear their intimate laughter. I activated the fog machine. A fine, cool mist rolled out of the kitchen window. No flame, no heat, just a theatrical haze. Immediately, a neighbor opposite shouted, "Smoke! Call the fire department!" The call spread like a pebble in water. Someone dialed 911. Sirens arrived quickly on the Upper West Side. The wail ripped through the quiet night. I pressed my face to the glass, heart racing as footsteps drew near. Declan murmured, "Luca is the chief today. He'll be leading the team." A sharp stab went through me, anxious, but knowing this had to happen. The fire truck pulled up. Luca leapt down in uniform, commanding the team. I couldn't take my eyes off him. He ran to the door, raised his sledge, and in a strangely slow-motion instant, the wood splintered and the crew poured in. Then I saw the image I had pictured 1,000 times, but never grew used to. Anthony near the foot of the bed, Jasmine on the edge, clothes disheveled, both shocked and embarrassed. They weren't physically stuck or hurt, just caught in a level of intimacy impossible to explain away with polite social lines. A few firefighters draped sheets over them professionally, an action meant to preserve dignity, not to mock. Yet it could not hide the truth. From the street came a startled voice. "Oh my God, it's them!" Phones and cameras appeared. A neighbor began live streaming. Dozens of screens alight like a swarm. Declan whispered in my ear, "Stay calm. I've got everything recorded. Anthony mentions the contract. I have it." My chest clenched. I could still hear Anthony trying to explain, voice breaking. "Anthony, I just—" His sentence died. Jasmine lowered her head, curled in on herself, tears falling. Their confidence from the photos was gone. Luca entered and saw his father and his wife. I heard the long exhale from him, a sound that felt like collapse. His face went pale, eyes wide, stunned. He forced himself to give orders. "Get down. Cover up. Follow protocol." He directed his team professionally, but his posture was fractured. For a moment, he simply stood frozen, struck dumb, before carrying out his duties. I realized then, this shock was not just mine. It belonged to him, to our family. A firefighter stepped outside and spoke quietly into his phone. "We need to know if there's anyone else inside. Any injuries?" Neighbors argued, some reproaching, some whispering sympathy. Minutes later, with the commotion subsiding, Declan tapped my ear. "I've got recordings from the hotel, from the office, everything in sequence. Do you want me to go public now?" I shook my head. I wanted the release to happen with the lawyer present. I stood there watching them wrapped in sheets, checked by medical staff, and loaded onto stretchers. They were taken away, not because of fire, but to protect privacy and ensure care. Minutes later, the ambulance pulled away, siren fading, and the block buzzed with relentless conversation. What I felt then was mixed. Relief that everything was exposed, agony watching my son stand like a man unmoored, and a deep sorrow because I knew nothing would be the same. Evelyn came up beside me, tears on her cheeks, squeezing my hand. "Are you okay?" she whispered. I nodded, expression unreadable. There were no tears left. Everything had frozen. That evening, pretending I'd just returned from Boston, I walked past the gathered neighbors and saw clips already posted in the neighborhood group and on social stories. The public exposure spread faster than I imagined. Declan called and told me he'd uploaded secure images for the lawyer's files. Back inside, faint smoke lingered, the trace of the fog machine, and I fingered the thick envelope in my bag. The evidence was printed and organized, page after page. I breathed out slowly, knowing the next steps would be the hospital, legal proceedings, and the painful conversations with Luca. But tonight, the truth had been laid bare in front of the neighborhood. That was exactly what I had planned from the start. The next day, I carried a thick envelope of evidence and walked into Mount Sinai Hospital, where Anthony and Jasmine were being kept for observation. The hallway was blindingly white, the smell of disinfectant clinging to the air, making each of my footsteps echo heavily. I knew this moment would come, but nothing could have prepared me for facing those who once were my family. The door to the hospital room was ajar. I pushed it gently. Anthony sat slumped against the headboard, his face hollow, his hospital gown hiding the figure that once carried authority. Jasmine was on a chair nearby, hair falling across her tear-streaked face. Both of them looked up when they saw me, guilt and shame flashing like children caught stealing. "Claudia." Anthony's hoarse voice was half plea, half excuse. "Don't say my name." I cut him off, cold as steel. I set the envelope on the table in front of them. Inside is everything. Photos, videos, contracts, recordings. All of it will go to my lawyer and the court. You have nothing left to hide. Jasmine burst into tears, sobbing. Mom, I'm so sorry. I stared straight into her eyes I had once trusted as if she were my own daughter. Don't call me Mom. You stabbed me in the heart, and in Luca's. You destroyed this family. Anthony lowered his head, his fingers clutching the bedsheet. Claudia, it was a mistake. I cut him short, spitting each word like poison. A mistake doesn't last for months. A mistake doesn't come with notarized contracts to steal everything. The room went silent. Only the steady beep of the heart monitor filled the air. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice from shaking. I don't need your explanations. All you need to understand is this. From today, this marriage is over, and the name Russo attached to Hudson Hearth Bakery belongs only to me. The law will decide the rest. At that moment, the door swung open. Luca stepped in. His face was pale after a sleepless night on duty, his eyes still bloodshot. He looked around, his father, his wife, his mother, all of his world packed into these 4 sterile walls. No one spoke. Finally, his voice cracked through the silence. I saw the clip. I heard the recording. I didn't want to believe it, but the truth can't be denied. Jasmine choked on her sobs. Luca, please, you have to let me explain. He raised his hand, cutting her off, anger flaring in his gaze. Enough, Jasmine. You've destroyed everything. He turned to Anthony, his voice breaking. And you, Dad, you didn't just betray Mom. You betrayed me. You turned our family into a joke. Anthony couldn't raise his eyes. His trembling hand gripped the blanket as though it could shield him from his son's wrath. I looked at Luca, my tears threatening to fall but holding back. I knew this wound would scar him forever, but I also knew that only the whole truth, dragged into daylight, could allow us to rise from the ashes. That day, my lawyer filed for divorce and obtained a court order blocking any transfer of assets. News spread quickly, from local Facebook groups to the New York Post. The first headline read, Upper West Side Bakery Empire Collapses in Forbidden Affair. Former bakery customers whispered, some sympathetic, others outraged. I knew the road ahead would be anything but easy, but at least the masks were off, and I, Claudia Russo, would no longer live in lies. In the weeks following the hospital scandal, life for Luca and me felt like we had been swept into a storm of gossip. The images of Anthony and Jasmine being carried out of our house in utter humiliation spread everywhere on social media. People whispered in markets, over coffee, even in the morning papers of Manhattan. But I no longer cared. The truth was out, and that was what mattered. Hudson Hearth Bakery suddenly became the center of attention. Crowds lined up not only for the pastries, but also to show support for me, the woman who had defended 40 years of work. The long lines outside the shop brought tears to my eyes. Every smile, every word of encouragement felt like medicine to my broken heart. Luca moved in with me permanently. Our dinners now were just the 2 of us, simple meals of soup or toasted bread, but full of warmth and connection. Every night he would sit by me, telling stories from his firehouse shifts. His voice wasn't as lively as before, but in his eyes I began to see a glimmer of hope return. One evening, as we were cleaning the counters, Luca suddenly said, Mom, I want to help you run the bakery. Not just the baking, but everything. The orders, the contracts, even the publicity. I want Hudson Hearth Bakery not only to survive, but to thrive. I looked at my son, my chest tightening. He had lost a piece of his carefree youth, but in his gaze shone a new determination. I smiled and nodded. We'll do it together. This bakery isn't just mine anymore. It's ours. In the days that followed, I began to care for myself, something I had neglected through 40 years of marriage. I joined a women's group at the community center, where recipes and life stories flowed like warm bread out of the oven. On weekends, I sat quietly in church, the stained glass light falling on my face, whispering prayers, not for Anthony or Jasmine, but for Luca, for me, for our future. One early morning, as the bakery doors opened, I stood behind the counter and watched the sunlight fall across rows of golden flan. It struck me then. I was no longer just the betrayed wife. I was Claudia Russo, a woman who had fallen but risen again, holding on to her son and the dream she built from flour and yeast. The scandal might have taken my husband and daughter-in-law, but it could not take my strength. And more importantly, it could not touch the bond between mother and son that was helping us begin again, from the ashes, but with a fire burning brighter than ever before. Sometimes the cruelest betrayal doesn't come from strangers, but from those we once called family. Yet in her darkest moment, Claudia proved that real strength lies not in clinging to the past, but in letting go, protecting her dignity, her life's work, and above all, the sacred bond with her son. If you believe that even the bitterest truth can set us free and make us stronger, leave a like on this video. And don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Tales for more gripping, emotional stories that inspire and empower. See you in the next video, where every tear and every smile carries a lesson worth remembering.